Hey there, party people. It's your boy Archlich, but you can just call me Archie, and I have finally returned. And boy did I return to a surprise indeed. I didn't know I got so popular while I was away, but alas, here we are. No, I didn't die, much to the dismay of many adventurers across the planescape, but I would be lying if I didn't say that I've been very busy in my affairs. But this doesn't matter. I'm here now to give the people what they want, and it seems that the Baldur's Gate 3 fanboys are out in droves because the people have spoken. They wish to know more about the Mind Flayers and their ilk, and who am I to deny them? Yes, today we will be talking specifically about Elder Brains and by extension Illithids and all the other little baddies that they use to make themselves a formidable foe. So without further ado, let's get into it. Elder Brains are synonymous with creatures in D&D known as Mind Flayers or Illithids. These are some of the most iconic monsters in D&D and are very popular among DMs that favor cosmic horror and other Lovecraftian themes. Interestingly, they were actually an intellectual property of Dungeons & Dragons since they were designed from scratch by Gygax himself, making their first appearance in the official newsletter of TSR back in 1975 when most of us probably weren't even alive. Since then, they've been a staple creature in the game, although their lore seems to be a bit wishy-washy at times. I think this can be used to serve the mysterious nature of the Illithid, however, as it sort of gives us an unreliable narrator, which helps preserve their mysterious spooky vibes to players and DMs alike. I personally love running Elder Brains, and I wish I got to run them more often, but it should be noted that to do one justice, you're going to have to put in a lot of work planning out their colonies, defenses, motives, activities, and the surrounding areas of their colonies. I think a lot of DMs treat these threats like mid-level bosses with some minions in their not a boss room trademark, but I think they can be much more with some proper tomfoolery. Now that we've got some initial information out of the way, let's get into the specifics. First, I think it's important to establish the big wrinkly brain boy to get an understanding of how it operates and what it wants. Elder Brains are very complex creatures with individual personalities that can vary between each one. In Volos, it says that they can be tyrants, while others are more benign, acting almost like guides to their people, as well as a large repository of knowledge for the Illithids in the colony to access, almost like a local form of internet, which is an idea we'll expound upon later. For you goblin brain monkeys out there, I'll put it more simply by saying that some of the brains are big and wrinkly, while others are smooth and very angry about it, which is off to get them killed. Unless the Elder Brain has gone all wacky on us, we're likely to consider that its priorities are rather simple. 1. Survival. The Elder Brain wants to ensure its survival as it sees itself as the #1 priority. 2. Survival of the colony. The meatball sees the colony as an extension of itself and growth. You don't want to get your fingers chopped off, and the Elder Brain doesn't want to lose its minions. Pretty simple to understand. And then 3. Expansion. The Elder Brain wants to expand the colony, getting more brains for more Illithids to be fed to the collective when they die. With this in mind, we kind of get an idea of Evil Sheen and how it thinks. It wants to stay alive and get bigger. Simple. Well, not really, but that's why I'm here. Now let's take a look at the stat block for an Elder Brain to get a feel of what we're working with. The Elder Brain sports an abysmal but appropriate AC of 10, with a hefty pool of hit points at 210. Well, if you take the average from the dice rolls, that is. Even though most people consider it to be completely immobile, it actually has a movement speed of 5 feet and a swim speed of 10, although it's supposed to kind of die if it stays out of the brine pool for too long or something. The Elder Brain also sports some pretty strong mental saves, and it has 3 legendary resistances, which it's going to need to make up for those physical saves it's likely going to whiff, although magic resistance giving an advantage on its saves against spells might come in clutch if you're rolling hot. Furthermore, it has decent strength, coming in at 15, mediocre dex at 10, stellar con at 20, stellar intelligence at 21, very good wisdom at 19, and for some reason its highest stat is charisma, coming in at a 24. It also boasts a solid set of skills, mostly built around manipulating people, and for languages it can understand common, deep speech, and undercommon, but it cannot speak them, and it has telepathy for 5 miles. It also gets a couple spells, but the big focus that we're going to be diving into pretty heavily in our tactics section is going to be about its special abilities that you see plastered all over the stat block that make this shit look like a small novel. I'm not going to read all of them out verbatim because, well, screw that, but I still think it's important to touch on them and give a general idea of how they work. First of all, it has this nifty, some might say bullshit, but I say fun and get good ability called Creature Sense. This is going to allow it to sense any creatures with an intelligence of 4 or higher within 5 miles. You can't really see them per se, but it knows where they are. If your players aren't a bunch of giant idiots waltzing through the Underdark, completely raw-dogging it with their thumbs up their asses, they can protect themselves from this effect with Mind Blank, non-detection, and other similar effects once they start noticing a bunch of spooky stuff happening to them while they're trying to sleep. No, I'm not looking them up for you. You can find the spells yourself. Next, we have Telepathic Hub. This ability essentially gives rules for how the Wi-Fi works in the Mind Flayer colony. While the Elder Brain is essentially the ISP of the colony, much like an ISP in the real world, his service blows, and he can only maintain up to 10 connections at a time. In a larger colony, this has to be absolute hell, especially since Homeboy has a 5-mile radius and can only talk to up to 10 dudes at a time, but I think we can work with it. It also has quite a few special actions, and one not-so-special action just being a wet noodly slap. It's got an AoE Brain Blast that allows it to give any creatures it wants within 60 feet an aneurysm. This is a recharge ability, mind you, so your barbarian is only going to be writhing on the floor most of the time rather than all of the time, which is nice. This ability is all or nothing though, as those who succeed on the save do not take any damage, nor are they affected in any way. Next, it has an ability titled Psychic Link. This basically spells out the rules about how it can connect up to 10 creatures at a time and mess with them. This does seem to be a separate 10 creatures from the 10 that are also set as a restriction for the Telepathic Hub ability. As long as Big Brain Sheen can sense it, it can affect a creature. It can then create a psychic link to any creature that's incapacitated within its 5-mile radius that it can detect. This then allows the brain to get up to all types of tomfoolery, but keep in mind this is a double-edged sword. Once the creature isn't incapacitated anymore, it knows that something is forming a psychic link with it, and it may attempt to break it if it so chooses. This ability is going to be the single most important aspect of the brain's kit, which we will talk about in the tactics section of this video. Lastly, we have Sense Thoughts. This ability pretty much states that the brain can read the thoughts of creatures it has a link with, and more importantly, it can plant thoughts and manipulate creatures using this as well. However, it's important to note that the target gets a wisdom save against the deception, and the deception, if successful, only lasts for an hour, which can be minuscule if the party's running around spelunking through the caves in the Underdark. Needless to say, this will be something that we're going to leverage to full ability when we get to the tactics section. The brain also has 3 different legendary actions it can take. They're all pretty solid, but I'm not going to get into too much detail about these, at least in this section. We'll talk about them more later, but if you're too impatient, just read the stat block and Volos, as these only matter once the party is fighting the Elder Brain in person. Now that we've got the stat block out of the way, we can get to the meat of running this creature in play. I think that it's going to be important to first talk about how the setup should look here, and I'm going to divide this into 2 parts. 1 is how the colony should be set up, and 2 is how the actual chamber with the Elder Brain should be set up. First, let's talk about the colony. It's important to understand that illithids are generally going to be operating out of clandestine colonies that are hidden, but close enough to a source of food for them to be able to survive and grow. This is because they are currently the targets of a never-ending interplanar jihad at the hands of the Gith, who can only get over their differences and stop murdering one another when they find the traces of the one thing that they hate more than each other: Mind Flayers. If an illithid colony of considerable size gets discovered, you can generally expect that there's a Gith vibe check coming real soon if the word gets out. This means that a lot of Mind Flayer colonies are built hidden through tiny little crawl spaces in the wall of some dank cavern somewhere near either a settlement in the Underdark or sometimes a surface settlement of some kind, although these are generally much rarer. There's a good map provided in Volo's guide, which I'll put up on the screen right now, but my only gripe is that it seems a little small when you consider that an illithid colony generally numbers anywhere between 200 to 2,000. And that's just counting the Cthulhu boys. We're not even factoring in the thralls that these guys are lugging around, or more likely getting lugged around by. Taking this into account, I think that the map provided is still a good inspiration for what an illithid colony should at least look like in theory, and you should be able to build off of it pretty easily with some imagination. I also like the idea of it being bored out in the stone, and not only making great use of both vertical and horizontal space, as illithids all have levitate, which means this setup would be no problem for them, while it would be a pain in the ass for any skullduggerers trying to gain unwelcome access. But it also allows the Elder Brain to have more real estate to play with its 5-mile range. Taking this design and expanding it out to be the size of a small town is where we start cooking, and then let's see where we can go from there. The colony should be set up in a very particular and intentioned way, as everything has likely been designed by the Elder Brain like it's playing a really cursed version of Cities Skylines, since it controls the whole colony and can have everyone work in perfect unity. For simplicity's sake, let's divide the city into 3 sections, Attack on Titan style. First, we have the outermost layer. This layer should be dedicated to either less important activities or activities that have to do with processing inflows of materials and thralls. The outer rungs should be where most of the slaves are kept, and said slaves likely should not be allowed further into the city closer to the Elder Brain, as this would make them a liability to the colony should the Davy Jones gang lose control of their meat puppets, which it seems they make a really bad habit of fumbling the bag in this regard, at least as far as their history is concerned. This will also make the process of harvesting brains and processing thralls much quicker, as they will be able to usher any captured creatures through processing facilities that are right there waiting for them as soon as they reach the colony. It's important to consider that this process is probably brutally efficient, and that the squid boys can likely have these poor bastards they've captured processed and on an indoctrination table faster than a Formula 1 pit crew can change a tire. In this outer section, you should likely find the guard rooms, the prison, the cleansing chambers, where victims are initially taken in and stripped of all belongings while being shaved and disposed of if sickly, and the common areas designated for thralls to gather during their precious little spare time for food and sleep. The middle layer should be where you start finding more illithids getting up to questionable illithid activities. It's in this section where you should find the following areas. The transformation chamber is where captives going through seramorphosis, which is the process of being forcibly turned into an illithid, should be held here until they complete their transformation, after which they should be inspected for deviancies or defects before being added to the colony. You should also find in this section the illithid quarters, otherwise known as living space, that should be scaled appropriately for the size of the colony. Generally, each illithid gets a single room or a series of personal chambers, according to the book. Make sure to pack this with personal items and other things to give your illithid some character. Another thing in this layer you should find should be the tadpole chambers. They should likely be here for the illithids in charge of finding suitable hosts to infect with tadpoles. Another thing you should find here is the library and dissection chambers. These should be for illithids dedicated to researching the anatomies of lesser creatures that their colony has captured. Here they vivisect creatures to study them, while storing their organs in a brine-like liquid that keeps the organs alive even when removed. This should be a grisly and horrid picture you paint should your party encounter this place. It should sound like some of the most disturbing shit you can imagine straight out of a horror novel. Imagine people still alive on the operating table, in pain as their entire chest cavity is flayed open like some sort of messed up game of Operation, while all they can do is stare. They can't even scream because of the psionic magic put upon them, and the party only notices that they're alive because they can see the victim's eyes moving, following the adventures through the room, almost undeniably begging them to end their misery if they could. Ugh, that's messed up. Did I mention that these guys are evil? Lastly, we have the innermost section of the colony, the downtown place, if you will. This should contain more illithid quarters and perhaps a much larger set of chambers for the illithid if the colony has one, with more fancy accommodations for the big special boy. Also in this layer should be the brain library. This is where exceptional brains are taken to be kept alive for further study. Again, the brine pool liquid keeps these brains alive. I like to picture the brains as all being kept on a series of different intricate stone diases. At first, this should be less horrifying than the Dahmer project going on in the regular library down in the second layer, unless the players find some sort of way to telepathically communicate with the brains to realize that the people are still in there, and they are eternally enslaved to the wills of the mind flayers. Make sure to make these combos appropriately horrifying. Lastly, you should find the Elder Brain Chamber, likely under guard of at least 8 to 10 illithid honor guard, fully kitted out with the fancy illithid magic items we see in Volos, and psionic spells to bring to bear. As a bonus treat, any nautiloid ships should be in this section under Staun's protection should the colony have one, unless they have one of the large colony-sized ones, which would likely be hidden in another plane for reasons we'll get to later. As a final note, I like to put a series of small-sized tunnels that allow for intellect devourers to be sent to different sections of the colony in quick order to help nail down threats that have been found in the colony while the illithid guardians close in on the location. This would be a very effective tactic that the illithids would be intelligent to employ to allow them to better deal with intruders in an efficient manner. This also gives your extremely based small race players a fun chance to get up to some tomfoolery trying to navigate the dangerous subtunnel networks that lead back to the intellect devourer pits, but also to get around most checkpoints save for the Elder Brain Chamber, that is. I think this gives us a pretty good layout of the colony and what it should look like. Now let's get into what I think the actual chamber with the big baddie should look like. Firstly, I think that if the alarm in the colony has been set off, and it likely has, let's be honest with ourselves, as most players have the subtlety of a violent car crash, there should be a psionic shield behind the doorway entrance that acts as a permanent wall of force. This is one of the many techs I like to give mind flayers to accentuate their advanced alien nature. I also like to theme the tech off of psionics since it's the cornerstone of their society. This means that the players trying to just kick the door down aren't going to find easy success. They're going to need to either have brought spells or tools that would let them get through or around this problem. If not, they're going to have to face the consequences of being the unprepared idiots who tried to raid a city of psychic brain-eating squid people without any preparation. Secondly, like I said previously, there should be a contingent of at least 8 to 10 Illithid honor guards that are pimped out in all kinds of wicked-ass Illithid magical gear. I'm talking special psionic barrier armor that gives them a plate armor AC at 18, with a Mind Blade longsword which deals an extra 2d6 psychic damage, and alternatively, some with Mind Lashes, which are whips that deal an additional 2d4 psychic, as well as proccing a DC 15 wisdom save on hit to not bestow disadvantage on all mental stat saving throws for 1 minute, with repeating saves at the end of each turn. Maybe give them a weird-ass ranged weapon that does 2d6 psychic damage and looks like a weird collector rifle from Mass Effect or something as well. I let them use intelligence as their ability score for all these weapons if they're attuned, as that sounds like something that would make sense with the mind weapons. I also give them the Mind Flayer Scion variant rules. This gives them some psionic spells to throw around to represent that they aren't scrub civilian mind flayers. Thirdly is the matter of the glass protection case the brain is contained within. Until it's broken, Jimmy Neutron's free to keep brain blasting as much as it wants since the party can't get to it. The only description we get is that it's a glass-like substance that blocks all attacks except for psionic abilities. But let's give it some stats. I personally like to give the glass an AC of 10 since it's very easy to hit, but I like to make it immune to slashing since trying to cut super psychic bulletproof glass is stupid, as well as elemental, radiant, and necrotic damage due to psychic warding. I make it resistant to piercing damage, and I make it take regular damage for bludgeoning, since that makes sense for being better against glass than the others. Finally, I make it vulnerable to thunder, force, and psionic damage, and I make siege damage and disintegrate automatically destroy it. I then give the glass a considerable hit point pool of 100, as I think going higher would be too much considering the resistances. It's important as your players try to break this glass that you express the effectiveness, or lack thereof, of their attacks on the glass, as repeating this will likely get them to realize that they should think about being smart and trying to come up with a more creative way of trying to shatter the psychically reinforced glass. Other than that, I think this is actually a sufficiently challenging setup in the room, and we don't need to add a bunch of other effects to really say that the Elder Brain is well defended against most threats. Finally, we get to the fun part of fighting an Elder Brain, which is the fact that fighting one is also fighting the whole colony. From the outset, the Elder Brain will be abusing the 5-mile radius, not only to pinpoint the location of any party too foolish to keep some form of non-detection up once they know what they're dealing with, but it will also coordinate the defense of the colony with staggering efficiency. Don't be afraid to direct thrall detachments led by kitted out Illithid warriors to perform flanks and pincer maneuvers, or to funnel the party into kill zones planned out by the Elder Brain. Perhaps they have a security system in certain areas that activates symbols of stunning on certain key traffic points of the colony. This would also be juicy because a stunned creature is considered incapacitated, so the Elder Brain can crawl into their mind and start planting evil thoughts, trying to turn the dumber party members against each other, reading their minds to know what the plan is, or perhaps confusing them about the directions that they've come from the colony, essentially causing them to get lost in the vertical tunnel system. It's also important to keep in mind that anything past the outer third layer is going to be a nightmare for the party to navigate. Since Illithids can all levitate at will, they will take advantage of this and make most of their inner colony passageways sheer, smooth, vertical passageways that can easily be navigated by them, but are nearly impossible for unprepared intruders to use. Things like this will really screw with the party, and the more time they spend getting stalled, the more time the Illithids have to rally their thralls and tighten the noose around the players' necks. The major focus of your colony's automated defenses, like traps, should be likely built around incapacitating intruders as often as possible through stuns, paralysis, or sleep effects that allow the Elder Brain to crawl its way into the minds of the party as often as it can to sow confusion, dissent, and to learn their plans so that it may direct the colony to counter said plans. If you get this all right, it should really feel like the Elder Brain is playing a chess game against the players, which should be an interesting experience as a GM, as you get to completely coordinate the entire dungeon to respond to the players and try to kill them in a way that normally would just be you being a bad DM. But this time you get to blame it on the brain and go hog wild. But now for the big kahuna, the actual fight with the Elder Brain. Let me go ahead and put this forward, that I think counterspells should not be able to counter psionic powers, as they're supposed to be entirely separate from magic. While we may use spell descriptions to give rules to the effects that Mind Flayers and an Elder Brain may evoke, they're actually not using magic at all. I apply these rules evenly, so if one of your players is a weirdo and they're playing some sort of psionic, they get this benefit as well. With that in mind, there's one last thing I'm going to add to the Elder Brain stat block before we begin. It's simple, but I think it's a good touch. I add Charm Person as an at-will spell. This is only at a range of 30 feet, so it shouldn't be busted, but it gives the brain a little more active manipulation in combat. With that out of the way, let's get into the tactics. Firstly, Its bread and butter is going to be using its 60-foot radius Mind Blast, as it does solid damage and stuns its enemies. The Elder Brain relies on enemies being stunned or otherwise incapacitated to really be able to use any of its abilities to good effect in combat. Keep in mind that all of its other abilities, other than its crappy little noodle slaps, require it to have established a psychic link, which it can only do to an incapacitated creature. Outside of combat, you can just do this whenever they sleep, but now that Big Sheen's in the hot seat, he's going to need to hope he stuns them. This is a recharge ability, so be smart and don't waste it on one guy in the radius. Once the party snaps out of it, they'll know that they're linked to the brain, but they're encouraged to not do anything about it since they'll have to burn their whole action to try and get rid of it. Moreover, their reward for succeeding the save is 3d6 psychic damage. The other main action it's going to be looking at doing is using the Sense Thoughts Deceive feature. It's basically going to use this to turn the fight into an Among Us lobby with everyone squinting their eyes and getting paranoid that the rest of the party looks kinda sus. While a brain's turn should be focusing on establishing links and making people sus, the legendary actions are all about exploiting said links with more concrete mechanics, of which it has 4, 3 if you're counting the ones that matter. First of all, it has a noodle slap, but if the brain's meleeing, you've probably already lost the fight. The first real one is breaking concentration. This one will give your casters an aneurysm trying to play against, especially the squishy ones that don't want to pay the hit point toll to break the link. The Elder Brain picks a linked creature and just auto-ends its concentration on a spell as long as that creature's within 120 feet of it. You should be spamming this on wizards trying tricky moves like fly, haste, or polymorphs. It's also good against clerics since they have a ton of concentration spells that they use all the time, and druid healers often get screwed by this too since they use healing spirit, but there's also just a lot of concentration spells in general that a druid can use. Needless to say, use this on casters and make them pay the troll toll if they're too stingy to break the link. There's also Psychic Pulse. This is possibly one of the coolest forms of crowd control I've actually seen in a stat block. This can both be used to separate a player from the rest of the group and separate the rest of the group from them. If the brain has a link with this creature within 120 feet, it can essentially turn that creature into a bomb that deals 3d6 psychic damage to all enemies of the brain within 10 feet of that creature. While this doesn't hurt the player this is thrown at, it both encourages them to get away from other players and other players to get away from them. This is also useful to use on downed players that the Elder Brain doesn't want getting back up, as it can use them to bomb any allies that are coming near. Throwing this on a healer is also good since it can activate the bomb whenever the healer picked up a downed ally, possibly even knocking them back unconscious in the process. Pretty cool. The only downside is the damage isn't anything to write home about. It's 3d6, which is an average of 10. Last, and least, legendary action is the Sever Psychic Link ability. This ability allows the Elder Brain to end a link on a creature within 120 feet in exchange for giving them disadvantage on all ability checks, saves, and attack rolls until the end of that creature's next turn. This can be helpful in specific situations, or alternatively, if you're a massive bastard, since you can end it on a creature that's down to give them disadvantage on death saves, since, what did you know? Those are saving throws too. Just saying. With all this in mind, it's probably starting to seem clear what the game plan is here. Try to stun as many people as possible with the brain and its minions. Anyone stunned, the brain should be trying to link to. If there are multiple options of linking, it will situationally choose, likely having a defaulting priority order of going for healing casters first, then other casters, then marshals, then rogues. If it links to a caster, it's likely going to keep pulsing them to try and get them to separate from the rest of the group for its minions to have an easier time with. And it will use break concentration anytime a spell seems worth stopping. Some mean ones I can think of are if a mage is flying really high, or letting someone else fly really high, or perhaps they're hasting someone, which you instantly turn off so they just lose their turn instead of going fast. If it's a healer, just bust any concentration healing or protection spells that they may be using. Clerics will hate you because you keep clapping their spirit guardians as well. If it gets a link to a marshal, as long as this marshal seems weak of mind enough, the brain will likely try to use the Sense Thoughts Deception to turn them against the party by planting ideas along the lines of, the party is going to betray you after you help them kill me and take all the loot for themselves, or perhaps it will convince them that they're actually allied with the Elder Brain. Basically, the mechanics are that it can plant one idea that the target believes unless proved otherwise for 1 hour. Each time it successfully does this, it can plant another thought, so have fun being sussy and having your party tear itself apart. This will be helpful in really sandbagging their effectiveness in fighting. Keep in mind, if the barbarian or other brand of big scary idiot gets too close, the brain probably won't pass up the opportunity to cast its one use of Dominate Monster to turn them on the most vulnerable person in the party that it can find. Oftentimes, if the party is sufficiently tied up by enemies, if this goes off and you throw the barb at the wizard, there's a real shot that the wizard's going down hard. So don't forget to use this as an Uno reverse card during the fight. Another important aspect of any Elderbrain fight is that it should have mind flayers coming out of the wazoo defending it. Not only should it start with an elite honor guard, but mind flayers should be showing up pretty much non-stop until the fight is over. I usually roll a d6 every 3 rounds and add that many mind flayers to the room, unless the party have figured out a way to seal the room. Then there's one last thing, the icing on the cake, so to speak. There's one spell I've intentionally yet to mention in Evil Sheen's repertoire, and that would be the oh-so-delicious Plane Shift. Let's say your party beats the odds. They get through the colony, they kill the guards, and they get the Elderbrain on its last, tentacle because it doesn't have legs. Right when they go to take it to Flavor Town, it just vanishes. Gone. They wonder where it went. What? Where did it go? They exclaim. But little known to them, the brain is now in a nautiloid brine pool, somewhere hidden deep in the astral plane, and it's planning its next moves, and it's remembering what the party took from it. Well, my evil acolytes, I think that this is a deliciously evil note to end this little lesson on. I hope you've enjoyed the forbidden lore that I've collected in my archives pertaining to the rightly feared Elderbrain and its illithid servants. Be sure to guard this knowledge jealously, as it is coveted by many an occultist and academics who study the little understood arts of psionics. I hope you find this dark knowledge to your liking, and enjoy torturing those pesky little adventurers with your new slaving monstrosities. But until next time, this has been your evil overlord, the Archlich, and as always, remember to never underestimate an Elderbrain.